I'm Garrett Barnes, and I'm going to introduce our dream team speakers, and they're going to give a presentation, and we're going to hold the questions till the end, and we'll do a combo questions from both this office, and we're live streaming it from the South office as well. So we got a great turnout, especially coming out today on kind of a rainy, humid day, but thank you. So our dream team here, we got Doug and Aaron Christie. Doug concentrates his practice on community associations law, primarily representing condominium associations and homeowner associations throughout Southwest Florida. Doug is one of only 198 or less attorneys statewide who is board certified specialist in condominium and planned development law. Doug is a frequent lecturer on community association law and at continuing legal education courses on topics of collection of assessments, effective covenant enforcement, and covenant preservation. It's all relevant stuff. And Aaron Christie is from Shoemaker, Loop, and Kendrick. Aaron's principal areas of practice are residential and commercial real estate transactions, zoning, and land use law. She is a former RASM Realtor Attorney Joint Committee chairperson and is a frequent speaker on waterfront property issues, instructing our very own certified waterfront specialist class here on November 6th. That'll be a really good one for y'all to sign up for. So the topic of this is planned community considerations for realtors, the FAR bar contract and legislative update. And we're very excited to have you here. So take it over.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have lavaliers. Oh, no.
Good.
That's fine. Wow. Am I muted? Can you all hear me? Okay. Mic check, Doug?
Me?
Okay.
Hello?
All right. So thanks for that introduction. We taught this class for the first time, I think, right at the beginning of COVID.
Yeah.
In case you guys are wondering, yes, we're married. We actually met practicing at the same law firm in different offices, and life has kind of brought us back to my native Sarasota, Manatee area, where we have two little girls, and they call the dog kennel a condo. That's how much we talk about real estate at home. But what is nice is that our practices are not the same, but they overlap. And I feel particularly lucky to be married to somebody who does condo and HOA law, because inevitably in our transactions, questions will come up from your buyer, from your seller, that really aren't traditional real estate contract questions, aren't covered in the FAR bar contract. And some of our presentation today is going to cover those things that come up, big deal points that come up that just, there was a leak upstairs and it's affected our unit. Who's responsible for that? Well, the FAR bar contract's not necessarily going to cover that, but we want an answer for that before closing, right? And that's where Doug comes in. Being able to answer some of those questions, help me. We kind of refer clients back and forth, and even have a mutual client right now. So that's a little bit about me. I do residential transactions, represent buyers and sellers. Most of the time we're working on the FAR bar contract. So that's what we're going to focus on today. And then Doug is going to give a little background, the big legislative changes that we saw as a result of the tower collapse happened last year, right?
Nope, 2 years ago.
2 years ago. Okay. See, this is why he's here.
It's on my birthday.
But there have been tweaks and little changes since then. So while we are going to do a legislative update and tell you, how the law stands now, it is going to cover really kind of how we got here, why it's there, why your FAR bar contract now contemplates those changes in the law.
You want me to do the?
Yeah. So I'm going to let Doug talk a little bit about a condominium association versus a homeowners association. In our deals, we hear these terms kind of used interchangeably, and they're really not. And the reason it matters is because you can have a property that has both going on. So Doug, I'm going to let you talk a little bit about it, and then we will jump in.
Okay, thank you. So obviously condos are not HOAs and HOAs are not condos. They are similar in a lot of ways, but structurally and big picture wise, there's substantial differences. Condo associations are regulated by Chapter 718 of the Florida statutes. It is a 90-so page bit of legislation that they change every year. Good for me. And essentially condos are creatures of statute. It is a way of subdividing property that is commonly owned into a workable form. Probably the most unique feature of a condominium association is the overriding involvement and responsibility of the condo association to manage, repair, replace, maintain, and insure the property. So as a consequence of that, in a condo association, when your owners are paying assessments, they are essentially paying a lot of money to insure the building that they all jointly live in. HOAs, not so much. HOAs are not creatures of statute. They're subdivided differently by plats and a lot less regulation in Chapter 720. So sometimes they overlap. Sometimes you will have a condo in a master plan community, but it's a personal quirk of mine or annoyance that people interchange those things and think condos are HOAs and HOAs are condos, because frankly, they're not, and they're not in big picture ways. And people sometimes get into those positions and think, well, I live in an HOA. The HOA must take care of everything because that's how it was when I lived in a condo. And that's just not necessarily the case. So,
Yeah. All right, thanks. And just kind of understanding that is helpful. And we're trying to give you as much background as possible so that you're as knowledgeable as possible when you're not just at the contract phase, but as you're showing properties to your buyers or helping your sellers list a property. So we're going to go through the FAR contract. I pulled this out. This is, we're using March 2023's update. Some things didn't change as we get into some of the new requirements with the legislative update stuff. You will see changes to the contract there. So here we have who pays what. I know we're all very familiar with this. And sometimes I think as realtors and lawyers, we can take it for granted how familiar we are with how a transaction works. One thing that I think is important to point out when you're listing a property that has an HOA or a condominium association is that the seller is going to have to pay the estoppel fees. Unless we change the contract, if you're just using the FAR contract, either one as it's drafted, the seller's going to pay those. And I've seen it happen enough at a closing table that I like to bring it up as like hey, give them a heads up, because they're really mad that they have to pay money to an association to tell the association they've paid them their money. I got it. I get it. But it's really good to point out. Doug, can you cover in a condo association how much can be charged for an estoppel fee? Because there are statutory caps.
Yeah, so there were statutory caps put in place, I want to say about 7 years ago. Initially, the baseline of the estoppel fee in condo land was $250. If there was an expedited request on it, that was an extra $100. And if there was a delinquency due, they could tack on an extra $150. So in the worst case scenario with a delinquency and somebody that dropped the ball and needs this urgently, you could be paying $500 for an estoppel fee. The legislation, however, also allowed those rates to adjust over time for inflation purposes. And I believe it was March of this year, DBPR, which oversees some regulation of condos, updated that formula as they were permitted to do, and all those numbers went up. So I had to look at this last night. Estoppel fees now are a baseline of up to, obviously associations can charge less, but I've yet to find one that would, but they can charge up to $299 for any estoppel. They can charge up to $179 with respect to a delinquency, and they can charge up to $119 for an expedited request. So if you add those up, again, in the worst case scenario, you're now talking about almost $600, $597, we think?
Yeah, $597.
Right.
And so let me back up because I don't want to assume estoppel is like a really silly word. And people are like, what does this mean? No, that's okay. I meant to cover this. So what this estoppel is, if you don't know, is the HOA or condo association, the manager, whoever's in charge of that, saying, okay, this owner is up to date or not up to date on their dues. This is how much is outstanding. If they owe anything, it'll often include whether, do you want to talk about like what you would typically have on an estoppel form for your associations?
Well, there's statutory requirements, and I generally don't suggest clients go above and beyond the statutory requirements. So you can disclose things for the condo context, insurance information is required. There's an open-ended question. You can disclose other things. I think there's probably a duty or at least a good faith requirement if there is a known violation to disclose it. And obviously, if you're gonna want to resolve it, the best time to do it when you've got the most pressure is when somebody's trying to sell the property. So basic stuff like that, if there's a master association, big picture issues like that are required, but I generally don't tell clients to go above and beyond what's absolutely required in an abundance of caution, again, with the exception of maybe violations.
Okay. And so it's typical that the closing agent, closing attorney is ordering that estoppel. So at our firm, we would reach out to the association and order the estoppel because it's really the title agent who needs that information to make sure that the buyer isn't going to take subject to a lien or some known violation under the documents.
For special assessments plan.
Correct, special assessment. So estoppels are gonna come up again as we get more into kind of what's due, how do we know it's due, and that kind of thing.
And yeah, by law, they're supposed to be good for 30 or 35 days, depending upon how they're transmitted. So there's, you're supposed to be stopped from changing your position. The whole point of it is that when you communicate what's owed, what issues there are, the party that receives that and relies on it can rely on it for whatever they're doing in connection with the closing.
Yeah. Right. And so sometimes we do have to reach back out and get an updated one if for some reason the closing date is pushed back. Typically, associations aren't charging us a fee for that.
They're not supposed to. If they can update it, they have the right to update it. And practically, situations can arise where there's a need to update it. If an estoppel is good for 30 or 35 days, it's entirely possible that on the day that the estoppel's prepared and first issued, there's nothing to disclose about a special assessment, but within a week, there's some crisis, and then they're planning to adopt a special assessment, and conceivably within that 30 or 35 day window, an actual special assessment could come due, in which case smart associations are going back and updating that estoppel to make sure that they capture that if it would be due within the pertinent time frame.
Right. And I saw somebody with their hand raised, and because we're live streaming in Sarasota, we're gonna wait till the end. I did put like little notes on your handouts if you have them. So if you want to make a note, and we'll come back to it. So just to recap, let's say we have a closing, it's in 30 days, there's an association involved. We're going to order the estoppel, when we do the title order, and your seller's been paying their assessments. Your seller can expect an estoppel fee of around $299. Now let's say it's a cash deal and they want to close in 10 days, and we're rushing around to do everything. Still, seller's been paying their assessments. It can be the $299 plus the $119. How long do they have to get an estoppel back?
I think it's 3 days. I gotta look at that. I'm pretty
I
sure.
think it's a little longer than that.
I think the expedited is.
The expedited,
Yeah,
yes.
I'm sorry, that's what you.
Right. My point being, when would an expedited be required? I believe 10 days is the response day time. So
Okay.
with 10 days being the response time, if we're trying to close in 10 days, we aren't going to have that estoppel back necessarily in time. So now we need to rush it.
Right.
So now you're at $299 plus $119. If your seller is in arrears and hasn't been paying their assessments and the closing's in 10 days, now we've got the $299, the $119, and the $179. So it's just kind of a scenario of how they would stack on top of each other, and things to prepare a seller for. On the flip side, anything else?
No, I was just gonna say that's per association.
Oh, right.
Just because it's a single property doesn't mean you're only getting one estoppel. That can be a master.
Correct. So here's in Sarasota County, for example, a good example of this might be Prestantia, where they've got a master association, right? So if you live in that big planned community, then you are going to pay assessments to that master association. But within there's a bunch of little neighborhoods, and there might be a condominium, and that condominium is going to have their own assessments. So now you have not only a condominium association in your transaction, but also a homeowners association. And both associations can charge this fee. So you're stacking them. Right. And that is why we tell the sellers in advance. So it does feel, unfair, I think, to people. And so it's just good to understand this is an obligation under the contract. And when you sign this contract, you're signing up to pay those fees. On the flip side, the buyer is responsible for paying any application fees or transfer fees that are required by an association. In condos, the transfer fee is capped at $150 to apply to be a member. And
But that will also go up over time with inflation.
yeah,
Just
but
FYI.
right now,
It had
150.
been locked in at $100 for like 30 years, but then they amended it 2 years ago and built in that same inflation adjustment every 5 years or so. So it's 150 now for the next 3 years, but it will change over time.
Thank you. So
Sure.
don't get too used to the fees, but it, you can say it's around $150.
Right.
In a homeowners association, there isn't that cap. So chapter 718, the condo statute, as Doug pointed out, is a lot more
Detailed.
detailed. Yeah, I was gonna say cumbersome, but yeah, detailed. Homeowners associations, don't have that level of regulation all the time. So here's a good example of it. And so, it'll require a reasonable fee, but we don't know what that is. And I will say, anecdotally, it tends to be lower than a condominium association, but that's not a rule. It's just, I think that that's a good guesstimate of what they're going to pay. So again, if there are multiple associations, you can be paying an application fee for each association. And that's not always the case. Just know that they do have the ability to charge per association. They've got different board members, they've got different responsibilities. And so it can be charged more than once.
Right, but it's not universal that they charge it. They have to have approval rights and they have to be able to charge a fee for it. So it's not something that
Yeah.
applies across the board
Thank you.
necessarily. Yep.
And for both of these fees, I think the question is, well, when does it get paid? Do we pay it in advance? Do we pay it at the time of closing? Oftentimes, what will happen, for example, our firm, if it does have to be paid in advance. So if the fee needs to be paid when the estoppel is ordered, our firm, and I think many other firms, will front that cost and then get reimbursed on the closing statement, so that we're not, waiting for a seller to write a check and then the check clears or whatever it is. With the application fee, sometimes the associations will require that fee come in with the application, which we don't really control. And so a lot of times the application fee is being paid by the buyer applicant when the application is being made. And if it is not, we can, if we get word from the association, hey, this hasn't been paid, we confront it and put it on the buyer side of the closing statement. But estoppel fees, I would say, are typically being paid at closing by the seller because they've been advanced for them. And application fee is typically being paid at the time they're applying. Okay. So more of who pays what. In standard K, this is where we talk about the prorations of how things are going to get split between the buyer and the seller. This is how we come up with the tax proration. In this is the association fees. So what this has come to mean are the association assessments. I'm sure that like the FAR bar contract drives you nuts in a lot of different ways because what we're really—
I never deal with it.
Yes. But what that is are the association assessments, and we're going to prorate those in the same way that we do taxes and other prorations. So prorated as of the day prior to closing. Go ahead.
I was going to say, just kind of background. In condominium associations, assessments must be due no less frequently than quarterly. So your assessments are always going to be quarterly or monthly. I've never seen one that would be on any other frequency. HOAs are different. HOAs can do it all once at one point of the year. They can be monthly, they can be quarterly. So that's obviously going to impact the proration issue.
Oh yeah, that's a good point that I have not considered when I draft these. I just take the estoppel for what it is. Thank you.
Sure.
So with that, and it's just something that, we walk through with the buyer and the seller, but so that you understand what you're looking at when you have the closing statement, sometimes the next assessment has not yet been paid. And so we're going to pay the whole thing at closing, and the buyer is actually going to give a credit back to the seller on the closing statement. lots of times the next assessment's already been paid, and and in that case too, the buyer's giving the credit back, but sometimes the seller is making up the difference. Like if they're, I'm having a hard time getting there, but it can prorate either way. And so it's just more of walking them through, you know, if you're paid quarterly, and that assessment was just made, then, you know, who will be getting that little bit of credit back? And oftentimes the estoppel's requiring that we pay the next assessment on the closing statement, but it gets assessed just like your real estate taxes do.
Really?
Mhm.
How can they do that?
Mm.
Okay.
Maybe because it's coming due before closing.
Oh, yeah, it's coming due by the time
Yeah.
of closing. Yeah, absolutely. Got that. Yeah.
In the contract, this comes up a lot. There's this section about special assessments. And special assessments are these trigger words, right? We're all worried about it. Are they gonna, you know, they're painting our building and we're gonna get hit with the biggest special assessment. This part of the contract does not cover that. Special assessments are covered in the condominium rider. These special assessments in the contract relate to things like on Longboat Key, when they were doing the undergrounding, right? That's an example of a special assessment and how those are handled. And before those assessments were actually incorporated into that tax bill to be paid, as we mostly see now, this was a really big issue of either the seller, you have to check a box. Either the seller is going to pay installments due prior to closing and buyer pays all installments due after closing, or the seller is going to pay everything in full prior to closing, and then the buyer doesn't need to worry about it. Well,
Would it be prorated?
nope.
Oh, okay.
So what happened there, if you had checked seller pays everything in full, sellers were being required to pay their $15,000, $30,000, even though they knew they were going to be installment payments in the future. They were not yet installment payments, and sellers got kind of stuck and blindsided in that. So just know, you all work on Longboat Key, and it can happen in other ways. Like if you're doing, as you move out east, if you're moving from septic tanks to county, that can be a situation where maybe a special assessment under a governing body comes up, and to Doug's point, a CDD.
Okay.
I just like to point it out, even though that's not a condominium thing, people confuse it, so we like to put it in there. Okay, now we're going to get into like the meat of it. The condominium rider and the homeowners association rider. Make sure they're attached. They're really, really important. And I see contracts come through with nothing checked and no homeowners association or condo rider attached, even though it's in one of those. I see it come through with something checked, but then the riders aren't attached. So just important, if it's in a condominium, homeowners association, or both, remember, both can apply. Check the box so that we make sure we're incorporating the rider fully, and then actually have the rider finished and attached. Okay. Getting into the riders. Doug, one of the first things that this rider asks us is the association's approval required of the buyer? Where would you typically, like, how would you know? You're representing a seller. The seller is really the person filling out a bulk of that condominium rider. But as you've mentioned, people are oftentimes kind of oblivious to the situation that they're living in. I know, that sounded meaner than I meant it to.
Yeah.
Where would you find this information?
In the documents.
But like typically
Sorry,
would be in the
sorry.
declaration?
It's going to be in the declaration. Declarations have to be recorded, and they're therefore out in the public records. They're also available to owners as official records of the association, but that doesn't mean owners will easily navigate those issues to find them. So I would assume that diligent sellers might actually just reach out to their
Does it say,
association.
practically speaking, just reaching out to the
I assume they're going to
association?
probably send an email to the community association manager, or if they know who the board president is and running up the flagpole. Now, that's not to say that that's the best way to verify whether that's correct or not, because obviously they can make mistakes, but that's probably, I would assume, a typical way that kind of inquiry gets made and that initial, analysis is done. But at the end of the day, the sellers are bound by those documents, and any right of approval that would vest in that would lie with the association, it's got to be found in the documents, because it's not something generally provided by law.
Okay, sounds.
Yeah. So pay your attorney to read the document. Sorry.
In the FARBAR rider, it does say that the seller shall initiate the approval process with the association and buyer shall apply for such approval. It doesn't, I mean, one, it like rarely works that way. Two, I don't know what that means, right? Does that mean the seller has to give notice to the association that they're selling the property, and then they have to get the membership application form to the buyer? It is really not clear.
Well, the seller's the only party that's got the right to get records and probably make.
That's different.
Well,
We're
I know, but if you're talking about an application form, if I was representing an association and some off-the-wall person who's not an owner says I need a form, I'm gonna go, who the heck are you?
Well, what do you want? You want a contract?
I would probably want a contract, and I'd want the request to come from somebody I know as an owner versus somebody I don't really know who they are. Even if I had a contract, I'd probably still be comfortable or more comfortable giving that form to the seller than to the alleged buyer.
Okay. So to that point, as an agent, what you want to be doing is helping your seller communicate with the association, saying, what do we need to do? We've got our buyer, we're ready to go. Is there a formal request to get the membership application? And I think a lot of times it all comes together, but I have seen it missed enough that all of a sudden we're 5 days from closing and we say, hey, following up, do you have your membership approval? And everybody's going, I don't know, what are you talking about? And so just one of those things to be aware of. Is it required, and how are we getting there? How are we going to get the membership application? And what is the process for that association? Because associations will have different processes for what is required to be approved. And the buyer actually has to use diligent effort to get approved. Think of this, if you've been to a class on getting financing, think of it like financing. They've got to submit the application, submit the payment, answer the emails. You cannot use not getting approved as you're out. If you're looking, buyers are sometimes looking for that out. We're past our as-is inspection period. We're past our financing contingency. And now I don't want to buy this property. I know. I will tell them I'm a serial killer with no money, and I'm definitely going to get rejected.
That might not be enough, honestly. Legally, that might not be enough.
I'll let you talk about that in a minute then. But you've got to use diligent effort to get approved. If you're not approved, and you've used diligent effort, then the buyer can be released from the contract, gets their deposit back, but diligent effort has to be used. Do you want to talk a little bit, since we're going into that, outside the FARBAR contract and really how this works? What can an association rely on?
Not much. I mean, there's a lot of risk in associations disapproving a buyer. You can't do it on any discriminatory basis because of fair housing laws. You can't do it in most cases for prior criminal acts, because they have to be so recent and so, for lack of a better term, offensive, that they would justify saying no. And even financial concerns are somewhat risky because, everybody's financial position is subject to change in the future. So just because they don't look good now doesn't mean they wouldn't be able to fulfill their financial obligations, and vice versa. They could look great now and, next month they're out of a job and filing bankruptcy. So it's a pretty high bar, in my opinion, for associations to legitimately say no without running afoul of applicable laws that protect, the right to housing. So I think to piggyback on your point, I think it would be a pretty difficult road for somebody to try to get out of a contract by trying to take the position that they weren't going to be able to get approved or didn't get approved, because I think that's seldom the case these days.
Right. Thank you.
Sure.
So it may really be an issue of timeliness. You know, not submitting timely and then not getting approved in time is not a reason to get out. The next part of the rider is this right of first refusal. So, and it asks, does the association have the right of first refusal? Do the members of the association, meaning the other owners, have a right of first refusal? And what does that mean? What that means, and we'll give an example of one here in a minute, is that before an owner can sell their property to somebody else, that either the association has the right to buy it or
On the same terms.
on the same terms, or the member has a right to buy it on the same terms. And one or the other or both could have a right of first refusal. Doug, where would we find a right of first refusal?
Say with me.
In the documents? Okay.
Going to be in the declaration of condo or the declaration of covenants, conditions, and restrictions, depending upon HOA or condo.
Okay. And so what's really important to understand is if one does exist, what time frame is needed to meet that requirement before closing and make sure that we can wrap that issue up. Here's an example of one that I had in a closing recently. And this is that the right of first refusal exists, but you've got to post it for a period of 21 days.
Association has to post.
The association has to post it, and any unit owner can negotiate to enter into the contract with the person selling the unit. So this one has a 21-day waiting period before they can sell to somebody outside of a member. If you had a 14-day closing, we're not going to be able to close in 14 days because we've got to wait the 21 days to make sure nobody else is trying to exercise their right of first refusal.
Right.
Mostly on that. I don't see those a lot, but they are definitely out there. So just something to be mindful
Yeah,
of.
I don't see them in client documents that often.
Yeah.
but-
Okay, now we're getting into the good stuff. Special assessments. Doug, do you want to talk about special assessments, what they are, how they come up?
Yeah, so the best way to characterize or summarize a special assessment, it is a funding mechanism for unanticipated expenses. So, typical associations adopt a budget for the fiscal year. Again, they're due in installments. Sometimes it's the whole year, sometimes it's quarterly, sometimes it's monthly, but I had a condo association about 3 months ago that their budget year is the calendar year, but their insurance policies run basically from, I think, July 1st or August 1st until the last date of the prior month in the following year. And they, budgeted based on, what their historical trends were with the insurance premium. And guess what? Insurance premiums went way up. So they were.
I think something we may, see
Yeah.
a lot right now.
So
obviously.
they didn't have a current budget that accounted for the money they were going to need to pay the premium when it was due, and they had to adopt a special assessment. It's a 14-day notice generally. What's the amount? How is it due? It's usually equal per unit or per lot, although that's not always the case in condos. And they needed to fund, I want to say it was $150,000 pretty quickly. And so the special assessment was the only way they had to do it, not only because they hadn't budgeted it, but they needed the money pretty quickly. And if they were building up that money over a year, they would probably even not get there if they'd raised their assessments for $150,000 the prior year. They're not going to collect all $150,000 that they need in the year. So they gotta kind of front load it in some cases.
Yeah, so insurance is a really good example right now of a specialist insurance premiums that you might be seeing. But other things such as painting the exterior of a building, or, different things can come up that you see special assessments for. Adding balconies or repairing balconies are some examples I've seen recently.
Milestone inspection reports, or
right, and
works
we will
discovered, and
correct. We'll get into this again with the milestone inspection reports. and the structural integrity repair study as we talk about that part of the update. So with a special assessment, when a special assessment's actually levied, that means that it's been voted on and approved by the board. But the contract takes it one step further and says the seller also has to represent that there's not been an item on the agenda or reported in the minutes within the 12 months prior to the effective date that a special assessment could be coming. So when I represent a seller, I recommend go collect your association documents, go do a public records request, get your 12 months,
Official record.
or your official records, go get your 12 months of
Meeting minutes.
and agendas and give them to the buyer. Because now you have disclosed everything that you could possibly know that you're required to disclose under the contract. If you don't disclose that as a seller, you run the risk, and it comes up that the buyer could say, well, you didn't disclose this, and now there's the special assessment that's come up that we have, found out about. You have to pay the special assessment because you, under the contract, had to disclose this to me. So if I represent a seller, I recommend they go get those and deliver them to the buyer.
Yeah, and so here's an important distinction. In condominium associations, anytime the board meets, there is supposed to be an agenda of what's up for discussion or consideration at the meeting. And more importantly, for both condos and HOAs, anytime they're adopting a special assessment, the meeting notice has to disclose that. What's the assessment for? What amount is estimated? HOA meetings are slightly different. Up until July 1st of this year, there wasn't a statutory requirement that there be a detailed agenda. So technically a notice of a HOA board meeting could just say, the board's meeting Monday evening at the clubhouse at 7 p.m. Here's your 48 hours notice. And you wouldn't necessarily be able to tell that there might have been some tangential discussion that would tip your seller party to the fact that there might be a special assessment on the horizon. And we talked about this last night. And I'm glad I don't have to deal with this. I don't know where the line is. Like if there's a discussion at a meeting, whether on the agenda or not, that somebody says, I think we're going to need to repair the pool next year and we don't have enough money. Is that, in your opinion, a disclosure requirement for a seller when that's mentioned in passing in the minutes without mentioning special assessments or any other?
Every lawyer's favorite answer.
magic
It
language?
depends. Who do I
Okay.
represent?
All right.
I mean, maybe
Okay. So in an abundance of caution, you would.
in an abundance of
If
caution.
anybody looking at that has reasonable notice that there might be a shortfall in the money needed, that's maybe a tipping point for
Absolutely.
a special
If
assessment.
I am representing a seller, I'm saying to disclose. And I don't even mean about just special assessments. If you think that there is something, and like, we don't have a crystal ball. I can't tell you everything that is, but just disclose it. Don't wonder if you should or don't, because you end up facing, the potential of a claim that you need to pay the special assessment, or a Johnson v. Davis claim that you covered something up, which is a different topic. But if I represent the seller, I do think easier you don't have to outline it in this section. You can simply say, like, see attached minutes and agenda items, and put that on the buyer to read through and figure out.
Okay. So don't formally take a position, but make the information.
Yeah, I would. Yeah, you don't
Gotcha.
need to
Okay.
formally take a position for those items. I think this to simply say, they're attached here.
But if that
for your
discussion
review.
happens, do you think that means it's pending? Or what does pending mean? Does pending mean they've noticed the meeting but haven't adopted it, or?
Pending gets defined
Oh,
as
okay.
reported in the minutes, or an item on the agenda.
Okay,
Sorry, guys, we're looking at the
fantastic.
same thing you are. And you guys, this gets argued about a lot. And so it's just really important to understand, like, what all can you do to possibly protect your seller or your buyer? If I represent a buyer, I ask them if they want to request the 12 months, minutes, and agenda items. I don't do it for them. I don't assume that that's what they want, because now it's disclosed. Some people want it and they say, look, I want to know for myself what's going on. So that's fine. I'll take that risk that now it's disclosed to me. But you know, with a seller, I automatically recommend it. With a buyer, I say, do you want to ask for them? So now what? So if the special assessment is levied or pending as of the effective date, and they get disclosed by the seller now and can be paid in installments, now we have a choice. And this is where people get confused on that thing we talked about earlier with the special taxing districts, because this is similar, but it's a different part of the contract. So you also need to look at it and make sure that you are making a selection here. Either the buyer's going to pay installments that are due after closing, or the seller is essentially going to pay the special assessment in full. And so that's a negotiated point. You need to figure out what that is. I see it both ways. I mean, I see it come through truly like maybe 50-50 both ways. So then if the special assessment is levied or pending as of the effective date and the seller didn't disclose it, and we find out about it, the seller's got to pay the whole thing at closing. It's going to come through on the estoppel, most likely. So that's why it's important to disclose. Then if after the effective date, right, you guys, I have been doing this for 14 years. I always have to read this part of the contract if a special assessment comes up. I cannot just ramble it off. I always have to go, what's the scenario? When did we get under a contract? When was the special assessment assessed? Who disclosed it? It's kind of like a paradigm where it's like, yes, no, and go through it. So I don't expect you to know these things off the top of your head. I'd be reading the contract all the time.
Serious question. Is it levied when they make the decision, even if the due date's in the future, or is it not levied until it's actually due?
Voted on and approved by the board. And I'm sorry, I might not have that here, but levied means voted on and approved by the board.
So it has nothing to do with when it's due. It's the board action that makes it levied.
Correct.
Gotcha. Okay.
But what do you do when it's just a discussion in a minute?
Right. So the question is, what do you do when it's a discussion in the minutes? And in that point, you need to disclose it. Right. This contract is imperfect.
Yeah.
And if it's a discussion in the minutes, and the amount is not known yet,
That's all you can do.
that's all you can do. There's nothing to be.
Okay, so now.
Yeah. And that's like when Doug asked, do you argue if it says in 5 years from now, we're going to have to put on a new roof and maybe we're going to have to specially assess that? Look, I would probably, as representing the seller, disclose that, but do I think that's actually some special assessment we're gonna have to collect money for on the closing statement? No. Why do I not think that? Because there's not an amount to be paid.
Yeah, they said it's not due for 5 years. It's Mr. Closing.
Okay, we're getting off the rails. So let's come back to levied or pending as of the effective date and wasn't disclosed. Then the seller's responsible for it, because now this buyer's under contract. They got under contract with the information that they had. And this is to say, like, okay, well, the buyer still gets to move forward with that deal that they negotiated. This special assessment coming up that wasn't disclosed to anybody, and is levied, will be paid by the seller. Sometimes, so let's not take this what if they kind of talked about the pool needs to be fixed. Where this is going to come up, where we're really going to see this, is the minutes say, okay, the special assessment amount is going to be $10,000 per unit. We know that's what it's going to be. We're voting on it at the next board meeting. We'll put it on the agenda. And that agenda hasn't come out yet. We know that assessment is coming, and the seller doesn't give minutes. The seller doesn't disclose it. And now we get the estoppel form. I told you those estoppels were going to come back up. And it says special assessment of $10,000 is due. We're going to say, whoa, where did this come from? Well, when you go back and look at the minutes, the seller should have known. And that actual knowledge is not, what they are. I'm sorry?
Not the standard.
It's not exactly. It's not the standard. You can't keep your head in the sand about the community that you live in and say, well, I didn't know we were getting a $10,000 assessment, maybe. you are assumed to have the knowledge that the association is required to make available for you. And in this case, that would be the minutes of the meeting, even if you didn't go, or even if you haven't received that notice yet. So that's like a good example of a special assessment that's levied, exists as of, or pending, exists as of the effective date, doesn't get disclosed, seller would have to pay it. If after the effective date, say there's so many scenarios, the association imposes a special assessment for improvements, work or services, that was not pending as of the effective date, then the seller pays amounts due prior to closing, buyer pays all amounts due after closing. Which means if they say you can pay it in installments, and one installment is due the day before closing, the seller's paying that. If the first installment is due the day after closing, the buyer's paying that. So it might not seem exactly fair, but the contract does contemplate what happens. And then, right, that's where we get into where section 5 is where we get into what's deemed levied for purposes of this paragraph. I will say that if somebody knows that there is a special assessment, and especially a substantial one. So recently I saw one, it was $75,000. The buyer and seller drafted a separate amendment for that. Yes, they had their condo rider because it's got required disclosures,
So
but they,
per unit?
Mhm.
Woo.
So they did their own thing. They said, what do we think is fair? Let's discuss this. And that's how we're going to handle it. So it doesn't have to be what's in this contract, but if it's not what's in this contract, you need to draft it as an amendment or in the additional terms, and address it there. Okay. I'm going to point this out. It almost never comes up in my day-to-day. On the condo rider, there is this sprinkler system retrofit paragraph. Doug, you want to talk just a little bit about what this is? I know you said although the law wasn't updated recently, there is a timeline coming up.
Yeah, they change this law every couple of years.
And what this has to do with is life safety.
Right,
Yeah,
this
go
is
ahead.
life safety systems. Older buildings weren't built to the current provisions of code, which were amended at some point to require, life safety systems like fire sprinkler systems. And every time there's been a deadline, the legislature's kicked it down the road. There's a process for associations to avoid having to require with this building code requirement by having a proper vote, recording that in the public records, and then that building is not on the verge of some expensive project to retrofit with life safety systems like a fire sprinkler. The current law says that local governments can't require this to be accomplished any sooner than January 1st of next year. So we're kind of in a window where associations might be on the verge of having some of these votes. And then conversely, associations that have previously voted to forego retrofitting can have a vote to require it. They can change their minds and they'd go through that kind of similar voting process. I think that's got to be recorded in the public records as well. But, long story short, this is one of those, kind of looming expenses that buyers unaware can step into that gets back to, assessments.
Yeah. And because there's nothing in the contract, we're going to get into, there are some things that absolutely can kill a contract. This is one of those items that, you're required to give it, but there's really no specific recourse if the notice isn't given to your buyer. So it's, if I had to use something to try to get out of it, you could try, but it's just not the same as we're going to get into some documents you must provide. And so you'll also see this because it is required to be in the public records. If the association has voted to forego the retrofitting, we'll see it on typically the exceptions of your title commitment. So when you see that in there, if you read through title commitments as they come through with an association, oftentimes you'll see this as an exception. You'll start to see it, commonly. Okay. Here is the like, I feel like this is like the big meat and potatoes of the contract, because this is where you can get tripped up. Non-developer disclosure, which means your seller. They must by statute provide the documents listed in this paragraph, again, pulling it from the statute, to the buyer. And then the buyer has 3 days from receiving the last of those documents to review them and cancel if they want. And this gets messed up sometimes, and buyers have a 3-day window to cancel. And so you really want to make sure when you're representing a seller that what is required to be provided gets provided. It requires a current copy of the declaration. You're hearing that word a lot. That's like the big picture. This is how the property is going to run. These are your restrictions. This is the lien. If you don't, we have a lien to foreclose. If you don't pay your assessments, that's like how it gets run. Articles of incorporation. I don't know why I'm going through these. It's your role. Articles of incorporation, you want to talk about, that covers?
It's the corporate framework of the association. It's, big picture structure, how many directors, who the initial directors are, terms of office, annual meetings, special meetings requirements, kind of those bigger issues.
And then the bylaws.
And the bylaws are the internal operating guidelines for how the association, conducts meetings, votes, voting rights, all that kind of stuff.
Okay. The rules and regulations.
Supplemental restrictions for the deck can't be any more restrictive, may or may not be recorded, generally adopted by the board, and special procedures in place if they're going to relate to unit use before they're adopted.
Okay. And then I'm going to skip the next bullet point, a copy of the frequently asked questions. So can you talk a little bit about frequently asked questions? Do all condominium associations have to have them? Because
Yes.
sometimes we come to a closing and we say, well, did you get the FAQ? And the association says, we don't have one.
Yeah, they're required. It's an official record they're supposed to maintain. I was actually on a phone call with the property manager for a lot of HOAs I represent, and she's like, there's a similar provision for HOAs, and she's like, we've not been updating that. Nobody asked for it, but we know we should, so we need to do that. And condo associations are no different, and it again relates to a disclosure requirement for your sellers. And I don't want to step on your toes. The association has to maintain it, but they don't have to disclose it. The seller has to disclose it. So practically, the sellers, I would assume, has an obligation to reach out to the association,
Correct.
request it, get it from the association, turn around and give it to their
Right.
prospective purchaser.
And then the seller says, I asked the association, they don't have one.
I don't know how to,
And now
I don't know how to deal with that.
And now
If-
we're in
if
a
I've-
conundrum.
Yeah,
A
if
lot
I've
of
ever dealt
times,
with that situation, I would assume my client's going to scramble and prepare it.
that's exactly what's
Right?
happening.
I mean,
Association scrambles and prepares it. Keep in mind, we are talking about condominiums right now. Like this is,
there's a
No,
similar, for
right.
HOAs, but yeah.
but for the FAR bar contract, these are required for condominiums. The HOA, it's like one disclosure and you're out of here.
But it's the same
Condominium
thing, right?
documents.
It's required. Isn't there a right of rescission if they don't have it? No?
No.
Okay. my bad.
Okay. And then this one's really important, a copy of the most recent year-end financial information. This is not the budget. Let me say it again. This is not the budget. This is probably the number one thing that when a buyer wants out, this is what they're using to get out. Because the seller gave them the budget, which you think is what you would really want to see moving forward, but that is not what's required. It's
No,
the
this is
year-end
the audit at the end of the year.
financial information.
Right, yeah.
And so you could be, a lot of times that's happening in March. So if you're closing in October, your most recent year-end financial information is, from last year.
Right.
Also, let's say you're closing in February. Well, now your most recent year-end financial information could very well be 2 calendar years ago, because you don't have year-end financial information from the year that just ended.
Right. It's the 2021 audit that became available in 2022 because the
Correct.
2023 didn't have
So,
2022
to me,
available.
It doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, yeah, I guess I want to know how you actually handled it, but what I would want to know as a buyer is what's coming. If you want to require the budget as a buyer, you need to write that into the contract because you're not entitled to it.
Right.
And
But-
so that's
But the
just one that
seller
gets
is
missed.
as an official record.
Yes, we're
I'm just saying.
I know,
So
the
seller can
seller
get
is entitled. And so important to understand those. I'm gonna let Doug talk. I think we should maybe fast forward because this is what's required under the contract now that gives you your 3-day rescission period, right? So we talked about that the retrofitting, even though it's required, not really a reason to get out. But similarly, as they start coming online, these milestone inspection reports and the structural integrity reserve study, the statute now requires that these documents, which we will explain soon, but I wanted, while we're talking about required documents, like the retrofitting, require that they be disclosed to a buyer. But as of right now, there's no recourse. Like, what happens if you don't? Does the buyer get out? I mean, that's really litigation. It's not an automatic out like these documents are. And I think we're going to see a change to the FAR contract as these reports start getting implemented and actually exist. The statute contemplates an addition of those to our FAR contract. So keep your eye on that. It's not changed yet, but in the future, we expect the FAR contract to be updated to include those documents.
So what do you want me to talk about?
Well, okay, so this is a good question.
They're
What was
not.
asked and is what's the association's responsibility in giving us current figures? But what I'd also like to have Doug talk about is who has the authority to request the documents,
Right.
and in what way is the association required to get those documents to that person?
Okay. So, right, so condo associations and HOAs similarly have what are called by statute official records. Everything Aaron's talked about previously is an official record. By law, official records are available to any owner, i.e. seller in your world, and or their authorized agent. So I think with some exceptions for tenants, generally speaking in transaction land, the seller is going to be the party that's got the right to seek copies of those records from the association. Generally that's a written request. I want to inspect the official records of the association. By law, associations are required to have some copies available at the property. In my experience, I don't think too many of my clients do that. Anyway, so within 10 business or working days, the association is supposed to respond to that request and make those records available. Sometimes associations play nice and will send them. Sometimes associations don't play nice and want you to come to the office or go out of your way to get those. But I would say at a minimum, if you're in a transaction where sellers got to disclose those things, they've got to, I guess, build in that time to make sure that they can adequately give the documents they need to give.
So as an agent, you'd really want to make sure as you're getting this property ready to list, hey, do we have the condo documents? Like, let's double check we have everything that we're required to give and have it in a package ready to give to a buyer who gets under contract.
Yeah, and then I guess technically,
And keep it updated,
I was
right?
about to say, technically make sure you're not sleeping on a meeting where something changes and something's not disclosed because.
So if a property, so say you do everything right and you get all the documents you're supposed to have, you have them ready to go and you list the property October 1st and it sits for a little while and you don't get under contract until February 1st. Keep in mind
Those
that
documents might have changed.
the documents might have changed, but also now what your seller is assumed to know from the minutes and the agenda have now changed by 4 months, right? Because it's the 12 months leading up to the effective date. So you've got to ask yourself, do we know what happened in the last 4 months? Do we need to disclose it on our condominium rider if your property is sitting out there for a little bit? To that end, I will cover this slide real quickly. I think you should check these boxes. This comes through blank so often. Your buyer requests the documents. And if you provided, when you got under contract, the required documents as the seller to the buyer, check the box and write the date in there. So there's no confusion. When I represent a seller, I ask for a signed receipt of getting the documents. If it's not done in the contract because they haven't been provided yet. I want to know the buyer agrees, they got all the documents, and this is the date because I want to count that 3 days to know that we're locked in. And then quickly we'll cover if we're gonna come back to that. I'm gonna make a note. It's not worth getting into now while we're so deep into special assessments, milestone, inspection report summary, structural integrity reserve study. So Doug,
Yeah.
now's your time to shine.
Great.
Can you talk to us, give us a little bit of background of what is a milestone inspection report summary? What's a structural integrity reserve study? Why did they come to be? Like, what's happening? What's going on?
Okay, everybody here remember Surfside 2.5 years ago? Okay, so this is all a result of Surfside for public safety reasons. The legislature had a special session. Can't remember if it was before the normal session or after the session, but in any event, they put in place some initial regulations that were designed with the purpose of ensuring that buildings aren't just aging and not being maintained. So to accomplish that, they essentially put in place 2 different new requirements to try to address that. One is to do these milestone inspections. They are required every 30 years from the initial CO of the property, and then every 10 years after that. And depending upon when the CO is, that can impact when the initial one is due. They are a phase 1 and then potentially a phase 2. They're done by a licensed architect or engineer. They're reports that are generated that do some, I don't want to say superficial to belittle it, but some, kind of cosmetic analysis of the condition of the building from that professional's expertise, what they think, if they think there are substantial or material issues with the safety of the building or the condition of the building, that would trigger a phase 2 requirement that can or cannot include destructive testing. And they're basically trying to gauge the condition of the building where there are problems, which in turn leads to the structural integrity reserve study. The structural integrity reserve study is designed to identify components of the buildings that are core structural elements, roofs, walls, paving, things like that, have to be there, have to be safe. How long are they going to last? What is it going to take to replace them? And whereas previously associations were required to fund reserves for these things because they're either so expensive or they're identified by statute, and owners could theoretically vote to waive or reduce the funding of those things, that is no longer available. The way the statute reads now, any budget adopted on or after December 31st of 2024 cannot waive or reduce any reserves that are essentially structural integrity reserve components identified in the statute. So you've got, on the one hand, somebody looking at the building periodically to make sure it's sound, not about to collapse, and doesn't need anything immediately. And then on the other hand, you've ostensibly created a unavoidable regime for building up the money you'll need to have in place so that when issues do arise, you're not going out for a special assessment. You've built up, $100,000 for the roof on the clubhouse building or whatever the case may be to be able to address those repairs or those long-term deferred maintenance projects as the need arises. And well, it depends on the CO for the building for the milestone report.
So the milestone inspection report, we'll go back to that one.
I got that one.
Oh.
You can't, the date in the statute is you can't waive reserves for any budget adopted on or after December 31st of 2024. But the reports are otherwise, I think, due well before then. I think they're due, I think by the same date.
Right.
I'd have to look at the statute. But anyways, associations are dealing with these issues now. And if they're not, they're asleep at the wheel. And practically, I think the logical consequence of this is, whereas associations frequently kick the can down the road, would potentially allow owners to vote to waive or reduce reserve funding, and that kept assessments low, probably artificially. That is no longer going to be the case ostensibly in 2025.
And so here's what this would mean for you. As we come into 2024, you're going to have sellers disclosing what they can disclose, which is that this is the amount of assessments I am paying, and this is how frequently I'm paying them. But if the association has not been collecting for reserves within those assessments, and they now are going to be required to do that, and we've got, there's some wordsmithing we'll talk about in a moment, but I really just want to understand if this works as the statute is intended to work, not what the statute says will happen or requires to happen, that the end of
Next year.
2024, assessments could be going up pretty substantially on January 1, because now you have to start collecting for your rainy day funds. And
these are not slush funds. They are like designated purposes, designated components. Somebody's looking at them.
correct.
Right, but they are
So
a rainy day fund.
this is a big question. So let's think long-term structurally for a building. End of December 31st, 2024. Are you getting the actuaries involved? If it's like a 20-foot high condominium off the water, somebody has to say, what's the present value? If I'm not gonna need this done for 5 or 10 years from now.
Yeah,
Can you repeat the question?
Come up with that number now, and this becomes this right now after 2024.
Well, there are professionals that, so the question was how detailed and involved and who gets involved in doing this work. Again, the milestone inspection report, which can feed into the structural integrity reserve study, is done by a licensed architect or engineer.
Or a team led by.
Or a team led
Now,
by, you're right. Thank you.
new legislation, told you like not much change, but there were little legislation changes here and there.
Yeah.
That, they're finding with Florida is the land of condominiums. And we had big development booms, right? At the 70s, the 90s, early 2000s, that you've got so many properties that are at this 30-year point that there aren't enough engineers and architects available to do it.
Right.
And
not
so
by
the team, while an engineer or architect are going to have to sign off on your milestone inspection report and seal it, they can be a team lead, and somebody else might literally be out there doing the work. Also, I think there's a 1-year time frame built in for actually getting your milestone inspection report done, subject to the availability of an engineer or architect to actually do it. So those are just 2 little tweaks. It doesn't, I don't think, like substantively change what we're talking about and how it affects our day-to-day lives. But
I mean, there are currently companies that hold themselves out as doing reserve analysis for condos in the current property regime. So I haven't dealt with this issue yet for any clients, but I would assume, practically speaking, they're going to rely heavily in doing any structural integrity reserve study work on, again, primarily what the milestone report tells them if it's available, and using those numbers and that analysis and what they otherwise know in terms of how much is this roof replacement going to cost, and what has the milestone inspection told me it's going to last, and just run the numbers that way. That's how they currently do it, but now it's going to have, I think, a little bit more certainty because of the analysis by the team-led architect or engineer.
And one thing that we were talking about last night as we were preparing for this is like the numbers don't actually change. What is going to have to be paid to fix the roof does not actually change, but the timing and the preparedness of the payments is what this is trying to help with. Because if you were not funding for reserves and now your roof needs to be fixed tomorrow, you're going to get a special assessment for that.
Right.
What the legislation is meant to do is make sure there's actually money in place without special assessing people to do that roof repair.
Yeah,
But
'cause
either
otherwise that was a
way,
hidden cost.
The
of owning a
repair is what
unit.
the repair
Right.
is going to cost. It's a matter of whether the association's been saving for that rainy day or the inevitable, like absolutely it will be coming day, or special assessing like that and having everybody have to do a $10,000 special assessment. So,
Or $100,000 special assessment.
yeah.
Just a quick question. When it comes to 3 stories, so 2 stories and under don't have to do it, 3 stories over.
Right,
I've
thank you.
looked at places that I'm about to show in Punta Gorda. There's a 1st level parking. With 2 stories of units above it.
Yeah.
By basement.
I don't know the answer to that. I've heard different opinions. I haven't had to analyze that for a client yet, so.
Is it in the statute?
It is in the
Story.
statute. It's 3 stories.
I know that, but it's story
from the bu-
defined.
It comes from the building code, and I'm not a construction attorney, so when I have that day, I will probably pick up the phone and talk to somebody I know and trust to kind of get their lay of the land.
Great.
I think it's-
Correct.
yeah.
And so, this is brand new, as far as being adopted. We've already had one, what we'd call like a glitch bill to correct some
Yeah.
things that were wrong. And I think that year after year, you're going to continue to see,
And this is also only residential, for the record.
yes,
That was
residential.
another
three-story.
fix this year, was, right, clarifying it's residential, including in mixed.
When are we required to start using this?
So the question is, when are we required to use this addendum? It is not in the FAR addendum yet. Right now, this is what the statute requires. And it's those documents that we kind of went into depth before. So starting December 31st, 2024, the statute updates this language, which means the FAR committee is going to have to update this language because it's going to be a required disclosure, right? This language is pulled directly from the statute and plugged
Right.
into the contract. And so keep using your condo rider as it is now, but pay attention as new updates come out because this language is going to have to get updated.
Right, but right now, the statute says these things have to be disclosed in 718-503 if available,
If
right?
available.
Right, so they just because there's a hard date in the statute for when there must be available, doesn't mean that's when everybody's gonna make it available, so.
Should we start using it even though it's understandable?
Do you want me to start passing around my?
You can if you want to. No, that's okay. I pulled March 2023's. You're telling me you've received a new like FAR update? Okay. Oh, in the receipt. Okay, thank you.
Makes sense.
But it's not, my point is, it's not a 3-day rescission. That's what I'm getting at. It's required to be given. It might be in your receipt of documents, but it's not a 3-day rescission period
If not provided.
yet, right? If not provided. And that will change
Next year.
next year and the next year.
Yeah.
You can pass that. We can go to questions because I think that this is
Pretty much.
good enough.
Yes, on the reserve study, I know you mentioned that you can waive reserves. You can't waive reserves anymore if you're 3 stories and above. What about?
Starting
condos
next
that are-
year, starting at the end of next year, budgets adopted on or after the end of next year are not supposed to be able to do that. And the open question that we didn't talk about, but Aaron alluded to is
The statute says.
the intent was you're not doing that for any future budgets, but in theory, you could game this out where an association in November of next year could ostensibly try to adopt a budget then for 2025, 2026, and 2027. Because they adopted it before that date, they could theoretically try to argue that they were able to waive reserves, even though the statute was intended to require them for budget year 2025, budget year 2026, 2027, because they did it before the statute absolutely prohibited them. Because it's not when the vote takes effect, it's when the vote happens.
The question that I have though is that going to apply to all condos? So,
No, this is
The one or
this is
two
where
stories.
This is the 3-story.
so it doesn't
Residential.
apply to anybody that's like in a 1-story condo or a 2-story?
No,
Okay.
they're not required to have the structural integrity reserves, and therefore they could waive them still.
And then going back to association approval, you said that financial reasons, there are things that they. can't
Very high.
do.
Yeah.
There is a local one here that I know that requires a 700 credit score. Is that something that is allowed under the statute?
There's nothing in the statute. This is other laws. This is, are you discriminating in the provision of housing and for any protected classes? Is that reasonable? There's a whole legal
Okay.
framework on that.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's all I want.
Yep.
Hi, could you clarify the first right of refusal? Is that after the association, after you're under contract, it's signed from a buyer and then they do the first right of refusal? If anyone in the association wants to purchase it?
It can depend. It really depends what's in your documents. Like for example, a declaration could say,
You receive an offer.
correct, if you receive an offer on the property, then you have to
Before you-
post that,
right,
and
before
before you
you-
can accept it, give them 21 days. So it's not a hard and fast rule. It's really whatever the declaration says the association or the members have the right to in their right of first refusal. If there is one, correct, if there is one, you might want to disclose that in your listing to say the association. I mean, I don't know that you have to. I don't practice in like licensure and MLS like Frex issues, but it might be helpful to put that on notice for people. Correct. Yep. Right.
As a listing agent, if I post in the MLS supplement section, all the documents that are required on these slides you showed us, and I put in the realtor remarks, all the documents are in the supplement section, have I protected the seller?
In my opinion, you have not protected the seller because there's nothing confirming that got to the buyer. I really want to see that the buyer received it, even though I know that you act as an agent under the contract. It's that the buyer has to receive it, and I would want to see a signed receipt as listing agent. Get the receipt. Yeah.
We get that receipt from.
You want the buyer to sign a receipt that they've received the
So
documents.
for the listing agent, you send a receipt to the selling agent, they in turn send it to.
Correct. Please have this signed by your buyer evidencing they received the documents on October 12th, 2023. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When do they actually have to be fully funded? When do they actually have to be fully funded?
When did?
Oh,
Reserve.
right. So, yeah, the way the statute's worded, I think has led to some confusion. You need to have the money funded when you know you're gonna need the money. So here's a hypothetical. You're required for the structural integrity reserve study to include the roof, which was otherwise already a required reserve. And your roof has an estimated remaining useful life of 3 years, and it's going to cost you $250,000 to replace. You don't need to have $250,000 on day one. You need to have $250,000 built up over those 3 years. It's fully funded means you'll have the money when you know or have reason to believe
When it's
based on the inspection of when you're going to need the money.
So you can see how how assessments reported on the condominium rider might seem artificially low. If it turns out when you are required to start collecting reserves, your remaining useful life on one of your reserve items is due quickly. So that can really change the amount of assessments being paid.
Right.
If you've got to collect $250,000 from your unit owners in 3 years,
And you've never funded
and you've never funded
It's
it
been waived
before.
every year, right? Then best of luck to you.
So that kind of goes back to the 12-month notification in the minutes that talks about what we're talking about, like who's going to be responsible for that information and who's going to be responsible for that levy.
I mean, that's not a special assessment. That's gonna be
Right,
funded
that's
over
gonna, so
time.
when this happens and the reserves
that's a-
start being required to be paid, that is not a special assessment, that's part of your regular assessments. So whoever owns the unit at the time is gonna be responsible for paying those reserve amounts
As part of the
as part of their regular assessment payment.
periodic assessments due every year, right?
So, say it's,
And our Sarasota friends can't hear you.
so say in 5 years, this special, the estimated useful life of a roof is 5 years. It has 5 years left. Can they front load that in terms of collecting up front, or is it equally broken out over 5 years? I mean, I'm trying to get at how they determine over time, if it's 5 years or longer, then we need the money now.
Well,
What
they know when it is estimated to need the work. They have an estimated remaining useful life of 5 years.
As
They've-
part of that structural integrity reserve study
And
that
they-
was done.
And they've been told what that is going to cost when that work is done, and therefore they know over this period of time, we need this amount of dollars, and they're supposed to build it up over.
Equally over. the 5
Correct.
Right.
I've
And so
never-
when this comes online, like, right, what does that mean for us actually? That as you represent a buyer and there is a structural integrity reserve study, your buyer wants to know, do those assessments that you've disclosed include reserves yet or not? If they don't, I really want to be looking at that structural integrity reserve study to figure out about how much do we think something's going to cost, about how much time do we have to fund those things,
And how much do we have?
and how much do we have in our reserve bucket
Right
to
now,
date?
right.
Because that's really going to tell them approximately, or give them a better idea of what kind of financial situation am I going to be in here when those assessments do start. And I guarantee you lenders are going to be looking at it. They're going to want that information.
Right.
Because that comes into effect whether you can afford your payments or not.
Right. And if the structural integrity reserve study and the milestone says you're gonna need $250,000 over 3 years, but you've already built up 200.
Yeah.
Not as much of a problem. You need to know what the baseline is and where you need to
That's a
get
great point, yep.
over what period of time to figure out how much dramatic, how much increase am I looking at just for that one particular item? And the list in the statute, I think, is 13 or 14 different items. It is roof, paving, walls, electrical, life safety systems, all basically everything you think of in a building that you see under the paint.
If anybody wants a business idea, I have not found the person. And if you know the person, please give me their contact information. What I have a hard time finding, what people ask for is, what I get asked to do a lot is, can you look at this budget for me and tell me, like, does this look good? I don't know. Like, that's just genuinely something as a lawyer, I don't know. But also, our firm also does developments of new condominiums, and we work with people who help us put these budgets together, but they're not willing to opine, kind of on a one-off of whether the budget looks solid or not, look at a structural integrity reserve study when those become available, because the liability is so great. So if you guys can find somebody who wants to start this business where we can look at budgets and assess, what this is going to look like for people, I just don't know who that person is. And it's a question that comes up a lot. But it's not the lawyer who can do that. And it's not you. Right, yeah. So you you want no part of that. And so it really, it doesn't exist, and I can see a really big growing need for that. So maybe I should have kept that to myself and patented that idea, but it's.
No, the point I was going to make is you need actuary. This is a lot more complicated. And I'm wondering if there's any set of rules, because you have the engineers, then you have to take into consideration inflation, the present value, the cash flow. If it's
Yep.
a year, it doesn't matter. You can get a number, but if I need it 10 years from now.
But what does matter is that no matter what, when those assessments, including the reserves, come due, you've got to pay them, because condo associations and homeowners associations have a lien right and the right to foreclose on property if they are unpaid.
Yep, and it's exempt from homestead protection, so doesn't matter if it's your homestead or not.
Can you address any new laws or regulations for insurance amounts that are able to go up for condo owners? I mean, everyone's got $200-300. Are there any laws or regulations that are coming for that?
So really the only, we were talking about this last night, the only place that insurance increases get addressed in this new legislation from the condominium association front is that can you talk about
Yeah, that's not new.
oh, okay, not new, but we were thinking about it in this context and in the insurance context, sorry, is that insurance can go up and there's no cap on it. And even if there is a built-in way in the condo act, and that owners could get together and kind of fight the assessments that are due. I'm not going to get into it because Doug told me last night he's literally never seen somebody succeed on that.
Yeah.
But my point is, even if you could say, hey, we don't agree with this budget and we want you to, decrease the budget, insurance doesn't count in that because you've got to have the insurance. This is there's not anything now in the same way that we've seen with flood insurance, right? Where they're capping how much it can go up year after year. At this point in Florida, there's nothing in place to protect associations and unit owners from increased insurance, hazard insurance costs. It can go up.
Yeah, I was gonna say, the only thing that's gonna impact rates are changes to the actual insurance regulations that aren't specific necessarily to condos. I mean, I suppose there could be some new funding mechanisms or something, but I'm not aware of anything.
Yeah.
I mean, they're just gonna go up if that's what the market calls
We have a
for.
question in Sarasota.
If you've already mentioned this, but my understanding, speaking to an insurance company, they mentioned that these new law requirements for fully funding for the associations will come into effect January 1st, 2025. Now, when you were mentioning that if, let's say, a roof is due in 3 years, and that's when that money is required for the fully funding aspect of it, how does that apply to the January 1st, 2025? Or what is required by these associations for January 1st, 2025?
Yeah, except for that date issue, they are supposed to start fully funding everything they're required to fund, and owners cannot waive or reduce with respect to reserves on budgets that take effect after December 31st, 2024. But fully funding does not mean you have to, again, don't have to have the money in the account until you need to have the money. So if your reserve analysis or your structural integrity reserve study says, over the next 20 years for all the required components, we're going to need this amount of money for this component by year 5. We're going to need this amount of money for these components by year 7. We're going to need this amount of money for these components by year 10, and all the others we'll probably need to replace in year 20. You don't need all that money on day one. You need the money you need for the 5 years by 5 years. You need the money you need for the 7 years by year 7. You need the money you need for the 10 years by the end of year 10, and you need the rest of the money by the end of year 20. So fully funding does not mean on day one. Fully funding means you have to have the money built up by the time you anticipate needing the money in the amount you've been told you need.
And if the association does not have it by January, December 31st, 2024, again, as the statute's intended, they will start collecting that in the budget year starting January 1, 2025.
Right.
So what are the guidelines? What do they have to provide by January 1st, 2025? 5 years out, 10 years out? If I have a buyer looking to purchase a condo, I need to tell them, hey, you can expect that the roof will be replaced in 3 years, and therefore you're going to have additional assessment for the next 3 years. Is that what I'm understanding correctly?
Yeah, generically, yeah. I mean, again, in that case, if the association was historically waiving reserves, and on January 1st of 2025, they have nothing in the bank for their roof, and they also have in hand documents prepared pursuant to those new requirements that say, hey, your roof is going to cost you $250,000. You can no longer not fund that. You've got to build up from $0 to $250,000 over 3 years because we think that's when your roof's going to go. That's what you're dealing with.
Okay. And the reason I'm asking,
does that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense. I mean, right now I had a client making an offer on a property in Beach Place, which is in Longboat Key. And at the time when we started, we came in, those numbers were not already in place. Obviously, the association dues at the time were $15,000, paid quarterly, obviously. And by the time we started going through the inspection period, we got some information about what the association had proposed, and they've already had the test and everything else. Well, at the end, they jumped to $50,000. And this, part of that was obviously this building was built in the 90s. So I was trying to understand, and the claim was, well, we're trying to be fully funded by January 1st, 2025. That's why the association dues have increased more than 3 times. And so that's what I was trying to understand. And the buyer actually backed out. Obviously, I mean, from 15,000.
I know who the attorney is. I won't comment, but I don't think they got that right.
And keep in mind that this, this is new legislation that people are still processing. I think one of the things that we did not tell you in Doug's resume is Doug actually sits on the condominium and planned community committee for the real property and probate trust law section, who is helping draft this legislation. So like Doug knows this inside and out because he is sitting in the room with the people who are trying to help fix, with the lobbyists for the real property probate and trust law section, what it says now, so that there is more clarity. Two, condo and HOA representation is something that you can specialize in Florida as a lawyer. I don't know if you all kind of understand, like the waterfront property thing. Doug is board certified. There are there are less than 200 people board certified in this. But what we're hearing, if as you relate it from Sarasota is true, that is probably somebody practicing condominium HOA law who is not board certified, does not do this day in and day out.
They're not.
And it's really important. And, I'm not sitting in a room of community association managers here, but it's really important that these associations have people who literally do this day in and day out and understand the laws, because that's a great example of those assessments are going to be insurmountable for some people, no matter how luxury it is, and it doesn't have to be. And so, that's the whole reason we
And
teach this
sometimes
is that.
boards and attorneys don't communicate on the same wavelength, so it's entirely possible that their attorney told them something that they
But the point
miscommunicated.
being, condos, as we talked about, are creatures of statute, and you've got to follow the letter of the law. It's why we teach on the FAR bar contract, and why these things are so important, because they're regulated differently than anything else. And it's just really important that you're working with people who understand it and know how it works. And if they don't know how it works, they know they don't know how it works, which is really like part of being a lawyer, is knowing what you don't know and getting people where they need to be. That's why I know Doug, because I know I don't know everything about 718 and 720. And I'm sure
know
we're getting
something
I think we're getting the hook.
Regarding insurance, our association, 1 year was 26,000, then it went to 20 or 46,000, and then this calendar year it went to 105,000. There was no way we would prepare for that kind of an increase. So we get to 2025 and it increases like $100,000 for insurance. We just basically doing a special assessment then? If you're not gonna have the money in the reserves for it.
Yeah, I mean, there are associations that establish insurance reserves, and I believe DBPR considers those to be valid, but I would also assume that any association doing a good job of adopting a budget is probably having some discussion with their insurance agent and getting their perspective on what they anticipate the insurance market doing in the coming year, so that when they're adopting their budget, and especially in cases where the budget year doesn't match up with the policy year, and there's going to be a change at some point that's kind of outside of their control, they've done a little bit of background to try and guesstimate what that change is going to be. But yeah,
But if they haven't,
the
the premium's due when it's due.
the premium's due when it's due. So you could theoretically amend the budget and increase the assessments, but that still might not get you the money you need on the time frame you need it. So you're probably left with a special assessment.
We are going to wrap this up. Doug Christie, with your own firm, and Aaron Christie of the Shoemaker Loop. I said you had the dream team here, and they performed, as you can imagine, as Doug said earlier, this is an ever-changing, complex issue. So make sure you don't put liability on yourselves and get the right answers. So this was a fantastic presentation. Thank you.